This is the second part of our stratification lecture. And here is the outline for this lecture, which is the second part of the stratification lecture. I'm going to first review some core concepts that are related to not just stratification, but specifically the way that economic stratification plays out. So this is income versus wealth, as well as mobility and meritocracy. And I will finish by reviewing the three main standards of equality as they are reviewed in your text. So, income, as defined by our text, refers to money that we receive in exchange for labor or a return on investments. So, this is actually fairly limited, and it would include things like the paycheck we receive for our jobs or a salary if you have a salaried position, cash, or an inheritance. Wealth, on the other hand, is something that we arrive to with an equation. So, what we do is we take what is defined as an asset, our total assets. This can include things like a home, boat, really high-end expensive artwork, stocks, or bonds. And then we subtract our debt. So this would include anything like credit card debt, student loans, medical bills, car payments, rent, or mortgage. So we take our assets minus our debts, as you can see the equation at the bottom of the screen, and that is what we refer to as net worth. And economists use this type of equation as well to determine what an individual's net worth is. So you can see that really what is tied to wealth is ownership, right? And so this is considerably different from income because most people, most individuals who do have an income are spending a lot of that income on rent, car payments, utilities, bills, and paying off various types of debts, especially student loans, right? So this is the way that we understand wealth as separate and distinct from income. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the way that income and wealth are distinct and that you have a better understanding now of how even if you have an income, even maybe a high income, which is very common here in the state of Hawaii, it does not necessarily mean that you have wealth, right? Which is linked to and tied to private ownership. So, when we think about the capacity of an individual to experience social mobility, which is defined as any movement between positions in a stratified system, so typically we're thinking upward mobility or downward mobility. I know that your textbook also talks about horizontal mobility, so this is up or down, as well as also lateral, right, where you can have a change, think like in a job, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be earning more money or that your wealth, for instance, is going to increase. It might just be exactly the same, but it's a new position, right? So that would be lateral, right? Mobility, side to side, as opposed to upward mobility, which would be like a promotion, getting paid more, maybe if you get an inheritance, and so you're able to do something like buy a home, right? And of course, downward mobility, which a lot of folks are going to be experiencing right now, and this typically is tied to loss of employment and or benefits. So social mobility looks different in different systems of stratification that was reviewed in the last lecture and in your textbook as well, right? So meritocracy is related to social mobility and complicates this idea that when we work, that we're able to advance, right, or experience upward mobility. So meritocracy, we can understand as a really widespread cultural belief system, and especially in the U.S., this is one of the defining ideologies of our culture and our ideas that we have linked to work and social mobility. And it's this belief that our society bases the status, right, the individual status and mobility of individuals based on their efforts, their ability, and achievements. So another way to think about this is if you work hard, you will be successful, right? All right, so what I'm going to do now is review three standards of equality. So your textbook actually reviews four. One of them is ontological equality, and we are not going to spend a lot of time focusing on that for the purposes of this lecture, but I just want to mention that it is something that's reviewed in the text, but what I really want you to pay attention to and emphasize in the next few minutes for this lecture is the three standards: equality of opportunity, equality of condition, and equality of outcome. So the way that we want to think about what these standards of equality mean is that they are essentially responses to and ideas about how to address inequality um, or how to address stratification. So, beginning with equality of opportunity, essentially, this standard of equality represents the idea that individuals should be presented with equal opportunities. So, I have these images here for the example of public education, which is relevant in our culture and our society. So it has not always been the case that public education was guaranteed for Americans, but it has been for your entire lifetime and my entire lifetime and probably your parents and maybe your grandparents' lifetime. Right? So we have what is called compulsory education in the United States. And part of what allows this to happen is that there is a significant tax base that goes into providing education from kindergarten to 12th grade for all individuals in the United States, right? So this is a really great example of how this standard of equality of opportunity operates in the real world, right? And so essentially, this standard is saying that if something like education is presented to all individuals, then what we have done is we have achieved our standard of equality, right? This is what is needed to address inequality or stratification, right? But as many of you can probably recall from your time in public education, whether it was high school, middle school, or elementary school, is that we know that not all schools are equal, right? They have different resources, they have different facilities. There's also the quality of teacher preparedness, what kinds of supplies are available to the students. And that is not necessarily something that we have been able to overcome in the public education system, right? And this is again just talking about public education. It's not even taking into consideration private or charter schools, which operate a little differently, right? So this is what the equality of opportunity standard represents. For the second standard of equality, which is the equality of condition, this is, I would say, a more expansive and a more progressive standard of equality, right? So again, we're thinking of these standards as a response to stratification, which is systematic inequality between groups of people. So when we're thinking about what does the equality of condition represent, it represents the idea that everyone should have an equal starting point. So this is different from equality of opportunity because it's going even further back in time, right? So it's not saying something like public education, right, or access to certain resources when you're already 5, 6, 7, or even beyond is sufficient. What equality of condition and those who advocate for equality of condition are arguing for is that our starting point in life needs to be equal. So the image that I have here is something that it's from historical um, records, and it's the city of Philadelphia. And so there's this practice that will actually be reviewed later in the textbook when we cover race and ethnicity. And it's this practice that was referred to as redlining. And so there are lots of examples of this throughout the United States. That occurred primarily post World War time period. And what would happen is that there was this concerted effort between bankers, real estate agents, and local government officials that essentially legally institutionalized discrimination based on race in housing markets. And so what we see here are these maps that were really common during this time period. And there's a legend you can see, and it's essentially mapping and color coordinating neighborhoods in terms of what is considered best. You can see the light blue represents the best housing, was considered the best neighborhood. The darker blue is still desirable. The yellow is declining, and the red represents hazardous. And so essentially what would happen is in these red and yellow zones, these areas in residential areas across these multiple cities in the US, is that it was essentially impossible to get a home loan at a good rate. You could get one, but the interest rates would be really high, or you just might not qualify for one. And additionally, it was really difficult to sell homes for their true value in these areas. And so this is a practice that took place again between a lot of different organizations and a lot of different people who held power and authority over the housing market for decades. And it essentially resulted in these neighborhoods that were very much aligned with racial and ethnic background. So what ended up resulting was in the red areas that were deemed hazardous or decline, the yellow areas that were deemed declining. These are neighborhoods where Black and immigrant families were moving into. So they essentially became these areas that became very disparate in terms of resources, and also for people to be able to keep their homes, to buy them, and or sell them for a fair price. Whereas you can see further and further out from the city center, which is kind of where we see the suburbs cropping up, and still to this day are kind of on the outskirts of cities. The best and the still desirable areas tended to be overwhelmingly white or Caucasian Americans, right? So this is a really great real world example that advocates of equality of condition would highlight to say, well, look, if there are these structural factors at play when we just think about housing and the way that this links to quality of life in neighborhoods, but also access to education and quality education, that it's not just enough to give public education. We also have to take into account these other kinds of disparities and inequalities that oftentimes happen when we think about residential segregation. Now for the last standard of equality that I will review, equality of outcome. So this, I would say, is the most expansive, comprehensive, and progressive standard of equality. And this is taking the position that regardless of the opportunities that are presented, and regardless of the starting point in an individual's life, that the true standard or the true measure of equality has to do with what is the outcome that individuals experience, right? So arguing that each individual must end up with the same outcome in order to claim that equality has been reached, right? So this would have a lot more to do with things like what are the types of living conditions that people are in, despite where they grew up, despite the type of education they had, right? And this could include anything from the quality of air, the quality of water, right? The types of other pollutions that may or may not be an issue depending on where you live. And so the various environmental factors that I just listed are a really good way to think about how someone who is taking an equality of outcome perspective and using this standard and advocating for it as the response to systematic inequality, to stratification, is essentially what they're saying is that it shouldn't matter what your starting point in life is. It shouldn't matter what kinds of opportunities are presented to you, that we cannot really claim that we have reached equality until we can see that everyone gets the same resources right at the end of the day. And so that is how the standard equality of outcome differs from equality of condition and equality of opportunity.